we're very happy to have, fresh from Boston, Massachusetts, Gloriana Davenport, who is, as I think you know, you've probably read her information floating about, but she's at the MIT Media Lab and is actually a principal research scientist and heads the Interactive Cinema Group. She's also a founding member of the newly created Media Lab Europe in Dublin, Ireland. Maybe she'll talk a few minutes about that. Media Lab is now franchising around the world, and Dublin Media Lab Europe is the first, and I think Media Lab India may be on the way. Media Lab Asia. And Media Lab Asia. Oh, that's the India. Oh, okay. Media Lab Asia is sort of happening, but I think that's exciting because it's going to take what's been a very successful research format and see how it works in various cultures in different parts of the world. Gloriana is trained as a documentary filmmaker, so her interest in interactive cinema is derived from that. And without going into more detail, Gloriana, if you want to add some more to your illustrious introduction, please do. But why don't we just move into the presentation? Thank you, and let's welcome Gloriana.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I have to say, Becky and I have threatened that I would come. Rebecca and I have threatened that I would come for a long time. But it's very difficult to make dates to come to West when you're mostly flying east to Dublin. And I've been spending a lot of the last 3 years actually in Europe. So I'm really thrilled. I love California and I love LA, and it's great to be here, and thank you for giving me the excuse to come.
It should be warmer, I'm sorry.
Right, well, that was, can't always have everything you want. What I wanted to talk about, I'm certainly happy to talk about the Media Laboratory and its rapid growth rate and its expansion in a global setting if that winds up interesting people. And I think I'm going to save that for questions and let people, if you want to steer the discussion that way, I'm happy to say something about it. But I wanted to talk a little bit today about my work in media storytelling. I started as I think I got my first camera when I was about 7 years old, and I was always the still picture taker in our family. My grandfather taught me how to process film in my grandmother's bathroom, which at that time, because it was all chemical processing, really stank. And my grandmother was always sort of horrified that this smell was sort of coming out of the upstairs. My grandfather was actually an engineer. He was trained at MIT, and I did lots of things growing up that were sort of neat. I built some engines, simple engines for sort of a little auto that I built. And he was a ham radio operator, so I was on pre-email, pre-digital on the network, meeting people and sort of understanding a little bit what it was to reach out globally to people who you had never seen face to face. And I never expected that those experiences would sort of collide and come back upon me. I became a documentary filmmaker after I was a installation sculpture person in New York for a few years, and then moved to Maine and became increasingly involved in video and film, and discovered that I was a documentary filmmaker without really knowing what that was about. And in 1976, met Ricky Leacock, who was at that point head of MIT called the film section, and I wanted to know more about how you made synchronous sound, how you could go into situations and really try to capture on film why people did what they did. And I came to the film section at MIT and worked with Ricky both in a research context and in a lecture context, and made about 4 films a year for a number of years, which was a lot of fun for me, and it was a wonderful time at MIT when things weren't too structured. Anyway, in 1980, I was at the Architecture Machine Group and sort of got introduced to a computer and realized that computation was really going to change the way films were made. And I thought how films were received. What is very fun about being in a research environment and bringing your own life and your own experience into that environment and deciding what you're going to make is that you never know exactly all the influences that are pushing you to do one particular thing. But you're really bringing together a very broad range of life experiences and an opportunity to, in my case, use technologies in new ways. And I think that I'm now sort of come full circle with the ideas, some of the ideas that came out of doing things with my grandfather, and some of the ideas that came out of the filmmaking context that I was in the 70s, and some new areas which include architecture and theater. So I'm very interested in how story is transformed in a distributed world to reach across audiences that are not face-to-face, in fact, or not side-by-side, but also how we create experiences where you're in the experience and you're face-to-face with that experience. And I thought it would be, well, it was fun for me to sort of think about how I might present this idea to a group of people. So you're guinea pigs. This is first time out of, this talk is the first time out of its box, but I suppose I always talk about the same thing in different ways. But being face-to-face in a malleable story experience is what I have become really interested in, and the directions that technology is allowing that desire to go are pretty surprising to me, particularly the physical aspect of what is possible to do today. That I suppose when you had shoeboxes full of still pictures, that's a physical experience, but then it's just pieces of paper arranged in a file drawer. And one of the interesting things to me about technology is now we can invent many new venues in which to have these malleable story experiences. This image, I sadly don't have the movie, but for those of you who were at CHI, how many of you were at CHI? Just happened? Nobody.
Gave a talk
Okay.
here, so I can
Okay.
talk a little bit
Okay.
about, but not the new one.
So these are, this is a very beautiful table designed by Hiroshi Ishii and his students, which bottles are put on it. And the first instantiation of this was allowed you to play jazz on this table. And so you could put the bottles down, and the bottles are coded so the table knows which bottles are on the table. And when you take the stopper out of the bottle, depending whether it's going to be the oboe part or the clarinet part, it starts to, one instrument leads into the other. Ali Mazalek, who is a student of Hiroshi Ishii's, who I've worked with quite a bit, and she actually as an undergrad worked on random access video edit systems. She really wanted to tell stories using this physical interface, and we talked around about what type of story this would be, and she came up with the idea, which is really lovely, of the genie in the bottle. I mean, what kind of story would you like to put in a set of bottles than genies? And for her story, there's a genie in each of these bottles, and as you take off the stoppers, the genies, if there are 2 stoppers off, the genies talk to each other. If there are 3 stoppers off, the genies are all gossiping. If there's only 1 stopper off, the genie is talking to you. So the issue here was to write a story where you could use an interface like this and really have it a very different experience each time you came to this interface. And I think that that's one whole area that I'm particularly interested in and have spent a lot of my time over the last 25 years working on. How do you structure stories that can be malleable in that way? That you can go to the experience over and over, and the experience is never the same. From a documentary standpoint, this is interesting because many documentaries are very complex, and you would like to be able to go in with different sort of points of view or understanding different points of view when you come out. In the case of a genie bottle, it's just a lot of fun. And maybe it's a profound story as well. So the types of stories I'm interested in are complex, multi-threaded stories, distributed in space over time. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we move into some of the work, because I'm really interested in things like casual architectural space and public art spaces, and whether you can have a really distributed story where you get little pieces of the story at different points during the day. So rather than going into a theater and sitting down and having an experience that is continuous, how can we have sort of a discontinuous experience that builds and we discover is profound? And I think part of discovering that's profound has to be that it has to touch us in certain ways. Personalization is very often connected or used as a term to talk about new media. The notion of a personalized and responsive story that is as if in conversation with an audience, so the story is very intimate with yourself. How do you build an audience that is not linked, not of the same culture necessarily, not in the same place at the same time? Many of these types of stories will invite co-construction by the audience, and that's something that I would like to understand what the invitation is. What is the invitation to the audience to co-construct? And many of these stories will use multiple layers of media. Let's see, I have to find this, okay. So a lot of people, when they hear me talk, one of the big concerns is that I try to not define story too specifically. In fact, I like a very broad definition of story where a conversation or a dialogue can have an aspect of story, but I think it's also useful to go down to some of the or to look at the way other people have defined story, and in particular, Jerome Bruner is a very profound theorist. He's mostly, a lot of his work has to do with how people learn. His thesis is that there are 2 modes of thought. There's a narrative mode of thought, and there's a paradigmatic type of thought. And a lot of our conversation or expression has to do with telling stories, even from the earliest age of let's say 2 or 3. You start to see kids being able to formulate something that has to do with individual actions, collective behaviors, set into some cultural context. These stories are perceived and interpreted by the audience through a process of in this case, co-construction with the author or object. And one thing that is very interesting to think about is how come when we watch a movie and we've got a scene in mind and we understand how the characters are moving along and a new scene starts, what is it in the human brain that turns off and allows that next scene to develop sufficiently before we hook it in to the scene before it? Why don't we just take that next shot and say, well, it's just a continuation of what we saw before? But there's something very profound in our perceptual experiences, and actually, when I first watched TV, I couldn't do that. And so I've also had the frustration of not being able to parse media. Obviously, you also do it with books and other forms of story. But the flip side of story is that there is a meaning which is culturally negotiated, and it is a reflection of the human condition, but it tends to be within our own culture, and it's why, as we move toward a more global interaction and as stories travel across the globe, there are a whole lot of questions that one can ask about how do we structure those stories so that they're really able to span those cultural differences. And then I believe, at least, that all stories are learning stories, that stories are an artifact of being human, of the way we express and communicate, and provide us with a means of learning. And if we look at how stories are changing, and particularly sort of game influences in stories, that a lot of that has to do with things that we need to learn now as we live in a much more democratized society, and we need to understand responsibility and choice, and a lot of these stories have choice associated with them. The other thing about stories is, of course, there are closed stories and open stories, and most people don't consider open stories necessarily stories at all because they don't have endings. But I think that in sort of the potential of how we can tell and how we can communicate frameworks, I think the openness of story becomes increasingly important. And if in fact you look at if you look at sort of early society and say there was news and fiction was a way that you passed cultural knowledge on, and news was a way you learned about the environment around you. If you look at news today, news repeats itself and repeats itself, but it always takes a story form if you listen to the story during the day that has a beginning and a middle and an end. But you could also imagine taking a happening thing and linking many of those incidences together so that you have sort of an ongoing, or what I would call an evolving story, that you don't know the end. And so we live in a world where we don't always know the end, and it may not be that in the future the notion of beginning, middle, and end is something that is a sure thing in story form. I only have one more slide like this, and then I'm actually really going to go into the work, but I think I thought it was useful to set the stage, and one of the things that I've thought about a little bit the last little while is what are the really big changes in story making or story understanding that have happened in the last, let's say, I sort of thought 25 years, and then I looked at 25 years and I said, well, we got to go back farther than that. That doesn't take you back very far at all. It certainly doesn't even take you to the first serialized TV show and I'm not, this is sort of a beginning list, and it's, I think it would be fun to do this with a group of people and just think about what the new ideas are. But sort of these are things that I think will converge as we're making, and the reason why I guess that I'm interested in talking about these right now is that the sort of pieces that I make on which have a research basis, a lot of the issues that this sort of list brings up are things that we don't even think about whether we're going to include or not. We just want to include because they're part of our psyche. So the whole idea of mass audience. Now, how does mass audience combine with the notion of personalization? But when lots of people have seen something, and I remember when MIST was around, and everybody was doing MIST, and MIST was sort of a benchmark in a way for a year or so. There's a push and a pull between having a mass audience and having a few people who really, let's say, understand your work, or in an interactive work can do the work, can go in there. Electronic distribution channels are relatively new. The entertainment industry as an industry is relatively new, and I think sort of the idea of media stories as a consumable item that you don't necessarily go back to. The sort of heroic nature of the pop and fan culture. Deconstruction and postmodernism were very important, particularly in the way they explored the ownership of story and who really had authored the story and who owned the story, not in a monetary sense, but in a spiritual sense. And supposedly computational and interactive stories are relatively new because we didn't have the opportunity to make those before. Some of the attributes include a two-way channel. There's some way for the audience to get back. This is one of the big frustrations right now, this explicit two-way channel, because when you get back to the story, are you really profoundly affecting what the material is? The sort of proactive consumption, that is, that I can get to the story when I want, where I want, at a reasonable price, and in the right medium. So one of the things that might happen here is you might think of stories that you want to have be full media, have full media elements, but also be able to be heard or whispered on your cell phone. Hypertext certainly was something that changed, and maybe it might be the most profound change in how we think of structuring stories. And muds and moos, which people help us construct. And then sort of gaming as a psychological framework, which helps us if we're going to enter the story space, may help us if we're going to enter the story space. So those are some of the things that sort of come in to my thinking about how to structure particular pieces. These are some of the pieces that I'll talk about today. They're all pieces that use time and space in different ways. They're not all mine. How many people in this room have heard or seen Tomorrow? Okay, so a few people. It's actually a theater piece that ran in LA for, I think, 11 years or something. Really, it only ran in New York for one, so New York, LA really beat it. It ran in a house here, and you came in as an audience, and then the rule was that you could leave the room in which you were to follow any actor who left the room. And the story was a sort of an upstairs-downstairs story, and depending what room it was you were in, depended what your interpretation of the story was, because obviously if you were upstairs you saw different things than if you were downstairs, and if you were... So one of the ploys in this piece was that you had a dinner and in the middle of the piece, and that you talked in the dinner about what your different interpretations were. And that is that cultural exchange, or that exchange between the audience members, is what I think is really exciting. It's not just that we have interactive stories that we go to, but somehow we need to have this society of audience that can negotiate the meaning with us. And that's what becomes really binding in some sense. An interesting thing about the Tomorrow production was that their hardest problem was holding actors, because actors hated it when everybody walked out of the room. And so they went through, in LA, they went through an enormous number of actors in the end, with very sort of emotional breakings up. I'm going to, let me just tell you a little bit about all these pieces, and then I'm going to show little bits of them. Wheel of Life, one of the things that I find really interesting is situating stories in architectural spaces with some amount of theater and putting the audience into a set and allowing them to take on a part because they're in a set. And part of that is to try to understand what are the things that drive you to take on a role. And usually in these pieces, kids do absolutely the best. So you're going to see two tapes that have kids as audience members. Wheel of Life was the second large opera of that sort that I was involved in making. It was made in a collaboration with Larry Friedlander, who was in the literature department at Stanford University and also a Shakespearean actor. And I went to him the summer before I did this piece, and I said, you know, and we were just talking about what it would be like and what we could do. And unfortunately, in that piece, it was almost impossible to film well, so I don't know what kind of impression you're going to get. David Kung is sitting here, and he was one of my students at the time, so he will be give you a sense of what his memory was. So I'm going to show a bit of that, and then I'll show the kids' room. In the kids' room we built at MIT, it's sort of a fairy tale space, and in which objects have magical properties, and the kids are led through a story, so they are running through a large space and getting bits and pieces of the story as they go. And then, so why don't I just run these first. Let's see. Now, Wheel of Life, the idea was to take water, earth, air, fire, and build environments that people would go through. And at the time, there was quite an interest in what would a computer guide be like, a guide that was not a person that lived on your computer. I was really interested in what real guides would be like and how we would make rules to make their guides, those guides, do something of interest. We have to switch. Right, I'll just back this up a little bit. Okay. Oops.
You did it.
What?
You did it.
Sorry. Let me just go back a little bit. Oops. Okay, so we're going to dump you first into, hopefully that'll go away. That's a little... So for water, we built a big scrim that was like a big fishbowl. And in this space, we built a big whale. And the whale had a red mouth And actually, you could walk into the whale's mouth.
You did it. You did it.
The story of the water space is that an explorer is picked up on a giant 25-foot fish bowl that's filled with fish and water imagery and very chaotic water sounds.
It wasn't there earlier either.
Will throw into specific points within the space so that they can accomplish a specific task.
So we have in the center of the Media Lab a very big space that's 60 by 60 by 50, and it's called the Cube, and the idea was that it would be a space for making opera. When the building was finished in 1985, nobody wanted to give any money to put any equipment into this space. So it's sort of one of those typical things.
And then these hints, these whispers and gestures.
Can you just?
Suggestions.
I'll do it. I know the routine now. Okay. It was very, very hard to shoot this, so it was understandable. Okay. So this is a big
As explorers, some guides.
scrim, and there's a guide that is sending messages to the video monitors that are around.
Talk to it.
And the guides are saying, go left, go right, talk to me. When you go into the mouth of the whale, the movement of your hands, the closer you get into the mouth. So he was the guide station sending messages.
You did it. You did it.
The story of the water space is that an explorer
It's Kevin Brooks.
a giant head and thrown into a 25-foot fishbowl that's filled with fish and water imagery and very chaotic water sounds. It has been their job to listen to hints that a guide will throw into specific points within the space so that they can accomplish certain specific tasks in order to be ushered successfully out of the space. It's the guide's job to send in these hints, these whispers and gestures, and very subtle suggestions of what the explorer should do within the space, what parts they should walk to, etc. The way the computer played a part in all of this is that it was constantly sensing where the explorers were. And there was also a camera showing on the computer screen exactly where the explorers were and what they had done. Also, the computer would help send in these hints with full-screen visual video and whispers and gestures to specific monitors within the space. The lighting in the space was also computer-controlled, as well as some of the sound and the triggers. So the entire experience for both the guide and the explorer was mediated by a central intelligence, in a sense, that would help make the experience.
I think this was the first large-scale theater piece that actually ran on a network, and it was a very slow network. Okay, this is David Kuhn's piece, so I'll just show a little bit of it. Otherwise, I'll cut you out, David. He was building Earth.
It is the dawn of a new day. Go to the house, listen to the full wind, and step in the right direction.
Okay, let's see. Step off.
There were sensors under these, this compass points.
In the Earth space, the basic goal of the explorer was to press the right buttons at the right time, and the guide would try to facilitate this exploration. And what we decided to do was to situate the user within an experience, and we grounded that experience in the world of Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias, which tells the poem of a decayed civilization. So we used that model to construct the architecture of the space.
So I'm going to, for time, eject David from this VCR. But first, the idea was that you help to rebuild the architectural structure, and when you had achieved that goal, you were again released. The compass in front of the pillars was, as you saw there was a big problem, because how do you know to step in the right direction? And what you had to do was listen to the messages that were being put into the space. The other problem we had was that initially when we designed this, we designed it for one explorer and one guide. When we opened the show, we had a pretty long line sort of out the door, and everybody who came to the show wanted to do both. They wanted to go through the whole thing as the explorer and again the whole thing as a guide. So we had to double and triple people up, and that created even more confusion, because you say go left and who's going left? Who's moving forward? So it was a learning experience. We also had to fine-tune the directions to the audience in all three of the environments that we actually built. So anyway, that was pretty exciting. It was pretty exciting for the Media Lab to have a theatrical piece that was running on a network. It was extremely I think the whole notion of interactive story, what that was, changed in the moment when we had a partnership between the explorer and the guide. So it was the first time where we'd really thought about how are we going to balance these different roles, and how do we put somebody into that role so they can take it on. The esoteric nature of the story, of course, made it much more difficult in some ways to get people to really jump in and do this. And people, particularly women wearing high-heeled shoes, were tended to, and even, I would say in general, adults were not too wild about doing things like stepping on things that they weren't sure what was underneath. And also, when you had to sing into the whale's ear, you had to lean down and actually sing into it. The third piece I didn't show you really had a game interface for the guide, and the guide did a game and learned from doing the game how he could then guide the people in the space. The kids' room was a collaboration between my group and Sandy Pentland's group. The technology in the kids' room is vision, looking down into the space to see where the kids are, what they're doing. Freedom Baird was the main story designer on this. You can see that there was some copying of Sandak's style. But the fun of this is these are embodied objects that are actually, the story space becomes the world. And I have a student right now who wants to deal with the world as a game board. And that starts to get at the sort of a way you can move story through space. They have to find a magic word.
Don't see the blue desk. Yeah, I'm the blue desk. What? I know about no magic word. Go talk to the green attendant.
Together to the yellow ship and see what views.
I'm going to just fast forward this. So the walls become monsters, and then
just still intact. Push the boat to the center of the pool, then jump inside.
Good job, my friends. Now it's time to roll. Everyone paddle to make the boat go.
so they even had a rock, which if you hit.
There's something big should not be fast, and with all at once, getting fast.
So that's the rock. And the end of this little story, they all get up and dance with the monsters, sort of doing the monster mash. The system knew which places were occupied and which places weren't, and actually could have a pretty good sense of whether they were actually doing what they were told to do or not.
It's time for the flat. We watch into it, and it's your turn.
So I'm going to, you get the idea here. So one of the things that I became interested in following this experiment was how we could, now I'm going to have to switch across. Whether we could sort of get story into casual architectural space and what that would mean. And one of the things about casual architectural space is it means you're not hanging out there. To me, it means it's a place that you're passing by. Maybe you might hang out, maybe you might not hang out. And we started a project that was called the Dream Machine. The Dream Machine, in some sense, was never fully implemented. Maybe we'll come back to it. Parts of it were implemented, but one of our first experiments was this one. So this is the edge of my laboratory. Now everybody laughed when they saw that, and there's something that is just very funny about pigeons, having pigeons there and flying away and then coming back. The next piece that we did was this piece with Jay Shree. Jay Shree is trained as a classical Indian dancer. This was put together in an authoring language called ISIS, which was developed by Stefan Agamanolis. And Jay Shree makes up for you. She just looks out at you and then she makes up for you. And she was not happy if you left her space. And that's what we sort of wanted to see. We wanted to see whether we could do some of these short movies and have you really have some emotional investment in the characters. People felt very, that they had betrayed her a little bit when they left the space, so that was fun. Now, we then took this piece, we then made a cinemat floor where you walked on the floor and you cut a story by walking on the floor, not knowing really what the story was. And we took that to the film festival at Rotterdam, and people were very curious, you know, and they'd look and they'd try to see what happened. We couldn't tell anything. We took the same piece and a few new pieces to Mexico. And I have been very explicit what it meant to do an interactive piece. Like, we wanted an open space where we could put the cinemat and people could play with this. And it should be casual architectural space between somewhere and somewhere else. They built us a theater. I arrived and I was just, you know, like, what am I going to do? Here's a theater. But it turned out that they had it was for a very big student event where they had about, I guess, about 50,000 students would come through in the course of 2 days. And they had us, we took 100 students every hour on the hour. And they had very good student guides. So I said to the student guide, well, this is fine. Why don't you just get somebody else from the audience, get 2 people from the audience, and one can tell the story, and one can play on the map. So this is going to be the output. You probably won't understand very much. Oops. The guy who stole it. And here's some old creaky stairs. If you go up the middle of the stairs, they creak away. Just pull that out. If you go up the edges of the stairs very quietly, you get to spy in the keyhole and you discover that there's a robbery going on. Now, obviously, it would have been great to, two points about this. It would have been great to develop this more and actually have it so it was a fully blown experience. There was a piece of it that you could do on the web and add stories into the mix. But the other thing that we really learned in Mexico is that in Rotterdam, we had no idea whether anybody made a story. And there was no way for anybody to output that story to anybody else. So the notion of audience really is important, that you have more than one person who experiences that and can share that meaning. And I think that that's, for me, that was, it sounds trivial, but it was extremely profound. I'm not going to show you the demo of shareable media. I'll do that with graduate students tomorrow if they want. But a big project we have in the lab now, as part of that understanding about audience, is a big server system where anybody can add media clips that they want. The API will be published so anybody can build an interface on the web for a particular use of these media clips. And in this particular interface, which is by James So, and actually it's not even the most recent one, but the idea is to be able to look globally at how other people have used the same media clips, and then have a very casual editing space that allows you to do very fast messaging with video. It's sort of important to start breaking down this notion that you have a movie, and the movie starts, and is a very long temporal extent. It had to be so for celluloid, and it really had to be so for broadcast media. But in narrowcasting situations, there's no reason why you can't, and in distributed situations, there's no reason why you can't have much shorter video pieces that are little segments or scenes. And so, finally, I'll talk just a little bit about our new piece, which is just opened at the De Cordova Museum in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And it comes out of some of this earlier work. These are bird cages that are instrumented so that when the door is closed, there's a bird, like those peacocks you saw in the beginning, looping around on a monitor. When you open the cage door, that bird flies away, and into the cage comes a message that has been sent, that has been made specially for you by some people who are working on a physical interface in the adjacent room. The physical interface is a table. It contains icons that you can sequence, and you can mark in and out points. So basically, you're thinking about, if you're really conscious of what you're doing, you're thinking about, well, would I like a location in this story, or do I want a major or minor character in this story? You're sequencing these icons. Do I want a message to be sent in the story? And when you flip your out point in on the table, the message that is now shaped from a database that we put together flies into the cage that is open there, and the person in the other room gets that particular message. The interface room, the sort of editing room, is also filled with, has news clips in it, so as you're using this footage that is quite intimate, story-like, you're hearing from the news about the foot and mouth disease or the crashing stock market or oil spill. News is unbelievably negative all the time. There's rarely a good news story. In fact, I think it's not possible. And just to give you a little flavor of some of the story elements, these are two stories that are running together, obviously.
Pumpkins are always full of leaves. In the winter, she sometimes together you can't feel the garden that seizes them outside, but if you have passion in your own, is your planet even alive until everyone else is just passing through?
So I'm going
Pumpkins are always full of leaves. In the winter, she sometimes takes a few out and freezes them. Let me tell you.
So those those would be like a little story that you might make and send out. As you put these icons together and throw your endpoint in, it grabs a clip of narration to join with the video pieces, so that that clip of narration sort of frames your story and usually is based on one location. So there are 3 locations. There's the city at night, there's the beach, and there's the gardens. And there are 3 characters, 3 different voices do the narration. And anyway, it's another experiment. It's sort of looking at how we could use poetic narration as a way of binding together pieces of media that aren't explicitly made to go together in that particular way. They're made to go together, but they're not made to go together in that particular way. So I will...
Can I ask about the icons that you showed?
Yeah.
Is that something you designed, and how do people know what the icons are?
Oh, good question. We don't know. They're icons we designed. They're the 5 categories of annotation that exists for these stories, and we have no idea how people will know that. And the museum is being very pushy to get us to put some, what they call didactic panel up. And we would like to have a little bit more time to see. I mean, they're very explicit in that you can derive, if I gave you 20 of them and asked you what they were and you were really looking at them, you'd probably be right on almost all of them. So the pictures are quite obvious, but why you put them together in a particular way, if you haven't thought a lot about editing story, is probably less obvious. We had thought of color coding them into groups, but then we really thought that people would join them, join the color coded pieces. So this plays out like a child's puzzle. These are all tabbed, so it's like those puzzles where you only have one free square and you have to move all of them side by side. Normally what you get out of that is you have a bigger picture. You have a big picture where you're making the picture puzzle. You know, it's like a picture puzzle.
Attached to them are certain sounds and images?
These are, well, underneath these are contacts, so we know where every icon is in the table. When you put your in point or you put your out point, the system calculates a path that will just go in here and then could go like this, or it, you know, if it were going in the middle, to the middle, it could go lots of different ways through that path. And we don't really know how to optimize for it yet or anything. But obviously, we've done a lot of work on annotation and video over the years, so this is building on some of that work, but it's not, we also did it a little bit too fast, so we had done no testing.
The exhibit will be like a user experiment to see how people actually what they're getting and how they figure out.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that it's very hard with story to figure out what people get out of it, particularly if there's no conversation that people have together. So the Media Lab has gone increasingly toward having user studies as part of the research. And the problem is that most user studies don't work very well. But yes, it will be in and of itself a user study. So I think that as George Fifield said, this is moving the art museum a little bit more to the research back room or front room or something. But I'm really excited about this because I love the narrational elements. And I think that they really do sort of generate a whole moment of sort of inspiration of how the images are working together. And we've done a lot of work that's either silent or sync sound. This is the first time where we've really tried to use audio differently. I'd love at some point to do that with music as well, but that was beyond our scope at this point. Because really understanding how these elements, what I've always said since the earliest days that I worked on random access editing type systems is I think it's very important that the systems sit between, that the viewing is the flip side of the editing. And so that you're really trying to construct an editor and software in some sense. Mm-hmm.
Also, do you want to go into questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
What kind of goal, dream project do you have now that you can't achieve but that you'd like to see yourself accomplishing within the next 5 years?
I guess I see story as being very distributed. We've done some work, and by very distributed I mean in and of the world. So it comes to you through objects, that it's distributed partially on devices that you're carrying with you in a mobile manner, part of it in architectural, in public space, in architectural public space, and part of it in actually objects that you might open. So for me, I'm really interested in this very discontinuous type of delivery of story. And I guess I would like to spend a lot of time actually writing one and implementing one. And so it's more research. What can I tell you? The other thing that I personally like to do in the next 5 years is I have an enormous personal collection of video that I've shot over the years, and I have some idea of how to put that together, but just no time. But I think distributed story is where I will be focusing a lot of my attention.
I'm just fascinated in taking a look at this backwards. Now we view our own existence, and we look here with a number of what has to be finite elements developing into a virtual infinite set of scenario. Now here we have, we take and look at that backwards, and we get a wonderful example of what Chaos theory really is about. I'm absolutely delighted with the way things are going here.
Come over and help straighten them out. No, I'll tell you that I have always loved shooting, and I love shooting documentary footage, because when you were in a big documentary story, you didn't know what would happen. And you were always at a situation where you had to sort of use your wits to figure out what is the next thing that was important to shoot. It was not an issue of just turning on the camera and keeping it on. Very often it was turn off the camera and figure out what you don't know or where you're going. But the editor, the pleasure of the editing room is to be able to take a segment and say, I can start it there and end it there, and it will have maximum meaning. And one of the things that was very interesting in doing this piece is I have a very good storyteller in my group right now, and I should have probably done the credits of this. Her name is Barbara Berry, and she is an oral storyteller who she makes up little segments of story and collects them, and then before she goes into an oral performance, she just walks out in the back room and she thinks which pieces she's going to put together tonight. So she has, for any given story she develops, she has maybe 30 to 50 little segments. And then when she tells the story, she puts these together, which I think is absolutely fascinating for an oral storyteller in a medium that traditionally, I don't think there are very many people who do random access in an oral tale. But they're very lyrical. And she worked with me. We shot together in England at the Kew Gardens. And then she and Ashleen Kelleher did some shooting in New York, and then we were all, so we were all there all the time. And one of the things that was very interesting is that they didn't have a good sense of what would make a shot in a system like this. Because a shot to an editor is if I have somebody walk across like this, the garden like this, and look over there, that's the end, man. You got to go someplace. If somebody's going to turn and look, you got to go someplace, and wherever you go is where that person looked. So what happens in our head psychologically, even if we parse it out differently later, for that instant moment when I look, that next shot could be what I saw. Now, if it's a totally new scene or a new place or whatever, that's what I was mentioning earlier. We parse out very quickly, oops, that's a new sequence, I better stop being here and with this character and wait. But anyway, so it's a lot of fun. I mean, to me, it's a very big challenge, and it's a lot of fun, and I think it can be very beautiful. And this is the most beautiful piece that we've made so far.
I was privileged to be a pretty good friend of Flaherty's cameraman on Nanook of the North. A fellow by the name of Glenn Kirshner. In fact, I went to his 100th birthday party.
That's great. Well, I should tell Ricky Leacock that you went there, because he shot on Louisiana Story. He was Flaherty's camera on Louisiana Story.
And in fact, Glenn's older son, Tom, just lives 5 doors from me. And he's now retired as a cameraman. But in discussing some of this kind of thing, here you are starting out. The documentary hasn't been invented yet. And there you go. Here you are making the first documentary. And, what do you do? How do you go about it? Marvelous.
Well, that's the fun of it. So all of you who are graduate students in this program, lucky you, what can I say? You get to invent it all again. But the invention is the fun part. Yeah.
I'm actually happy you brought up this list of credits as a backdrop to my question about the process, because it's starting to look like an independent film credit, which is it's not really an independent film, not really a documentary, not really a game, not really an interactive art piece. And half of the audience here are producers or wannabe big production producers of these kind of works. Can you give some kind of idea of what the process is and what your role is and how much funding and fundraising goes into this kind of work?
Less funding and fundraising than probably should happen, but usually in these, I used to teach a class at MIT called Workshop in Elastic Movie Time, and the Wheel of Life was actually made as a part of that workshop. There were no lights in the cube at the time, so we had to rent lights, and because we delayed the opening, we had to rent them for longer, and I had students hanging lead pipe, which put me almost out of commission for a while because I was so nervous that something would happen. And I went about $18,000 over budget, and I can remember going in and admitting that I had gone $18,000 over budget. Anyway, it got sorted. Some of things like the kids' room just grow out of research, and so they're really part of our sponsors. Our sponsors fund that. We're out there a lot. not trying to get our sponsors to give us money. The Media Lab takes no directed research. It's all, it's sort of, you join a club and we have 180 industrial sponsors. So it's a very big club and has to be managed. But usually in these pieces, somebody comes up with the idea, and most of the work that I saw, not all of the work, but most of the work is work where I wanted to try something. And then the students get, if they get excited about it, then they start working in teams, and what is very good from our perspective is that they learn to work in teams and sometimes overcome very big difficulties of either wanting to be totally independent or not liking somebody or having a difficulty with somebody, learning, figuring out how to be part of a team, how to be a very good contributing member of a team is, I think, a very important piece. But yeah, these are very, they're very time consuming, and they're very much production.
Do you look for people with certain talents, or do people just, you have someone who's lighting design, someone who's interface?
It depends. If I know somebody who would be a good talent, for instance, in this last piece, I probably should have gotten Janet Sonnenberg involved, just from a standpoint of theater. I did Maureen Thomas, who's a very good friend of mine in England, was a part. This table was really our idea. It was manufactured outside the lab by a very, very good woodworker. I also put a production manager onto this particular event because I was only there half-time. The cages I found in London, and they were instrumented using Lego sets. But yes, you try to pull in a diverse group of students. The nice thing about the Media Lab is that it is a very diverse group of people, and one of my students, for instance, had always wanted to build physical interfaces and was terrified of building physical interfaces and just wouldn't even go down. I mean, we have a laser cutter. We have more tools in that building that are really fun to work with. I mean, you're a student. You go down there and do it. But I think it was the same thing that we had a problem in Wheel of Life. Nobody in the group that we had put together had ever done set building. And when you do set building for the theater, you learn some tricks, and it's no problem to take a can of paint and have something look sort of messy. But nobody really knew how to do that. In Wheel of Life, there was a very, very good lighting designer at MIT at the time. I forget how I actually met up with him, but anyway, I asked him to do it and to do the lighting design, and he was thrilled to do that. So a lot of, as you know, when you do production, your first big production, you ask for a lot of freebies. We ask for a lot of freebies all the time. We're always trying to talk somebody into doing something for us for free. But I think it's interesting because there is a lot of discussion right now in the world of new media, particularly when you're doing the first or second production, about who your team is and who owns the work, whose work is it. And I'm extraordinarily lucky to work with just an incredibly diverse group of very, very talented students, and they all own it in some part. I mean, in this piece, there's no one person. I may have decided at one point that I'm going to do this piece, and they're all going to do it with me because I was asked to do it. I was given the museum space. But in fact, everybody contributed different things to it in equal amount, and I like working that way.
Gloriana, how do you balance with your students the kind of development of their own personal vision versus working in teams? Because it seems like both of those things
Well, I mean, we built this, we started to talk about this in the fall, but this was really built soup to nuts from January to today or whenever it's been debugged. So they all have thesis projects, which are not, this is not their thesis project. I would be very unhappy if any of them who are writing a thesis this year did not include something about this project in their thesis, because I think they all learned something, and some of them learned things that they needed to learn. So I consider it just part of that stream. But you know, you have to have your own ideas, absolutely. But I also do work that where I invite people to have ideas. So.
Yeah. Do you still concentrate to the same extent as the title of your program would indicate on the notion of interactive cinema? Because I noticed in your talk today, you didn't really discuss cinema as an idea, as a myth, in the same way that I would have expected maybe 5 or 10 years ago. You used installation, theater, distributed story, but not the term cinema. And I wonder if that's an idea that's played out.
Well, it's a good question. I actually came up with the title in 1988 in desperation. But I think this is the inheritor of cinema. It's just that I think cinema, when you take celluloid away from cinema, the medium is forever and fundamentally different. And I don't think, you know, I think stories that are made today come out of that language. We can't, this piece would absolutely not work without that language.
But why isn't it interactive television or interactive video? The question is...
Well, television is even worse. I mean, television is a total monolith that should die a quick death. Whoops. You might run out of time on that one. No, I mean, I would never, I mean, you know, I'm working with the BBC right now on an actual program for interactive television per se, and it's very like this piece. The methodology is slightly different. The story methodology is great, actually. It's a workshop structure that I evolved, and it's the BBC. The biggest problem with the BBC is no writers for interactive. Cannot get a writer. You get a young writer that has had any success in one-way, you know, linear storytelling, they're stuck there. They know how to make the beginning, the middle, and the end. They know what the character should do. They know all the hot buttons it's going to press with you. And so the biggest thing that is cutting into the potential production pool, I think, is the writer. And if we could pass that hurdle, then I think the technology, well, it's limping along in television, and interactive television is sort of limping along, but it will get there. If it goes out, it'll either go all the way over to the network or the boxes will actually get reasonable. But the writing is not there at all. And all of these pieces, I would say, the fundamental issue that is behind all of this sort of work is that particular issue of how do you structure a story. I know how to do it in documentary. I can take 50 characters and have 10 themes, 10 major themes in the story, and you have a very complex way to move through the story structure. But in fiction, it's just not there yet. So that's probably different than what most people would tell you, but I think that it's a very big problem. But television, I think there are many things that one needs to bring up about television to make it sort of move into this millennium.
So when you're talking about cinema, you're talking about a certain kind of idea one has of what cinema is? And
I'm talking about the invocation of cinema as a mytheme. In other words, that people want to talk about interactive cinema when, in fact, they're making either interactive video, interactive installation, or interactive television. And it doesn't strike me as having that much to do with cinema as it's experienced or as it's been historicized.
But see, I would say cinema is about a language of motion pictures and sound coming together. I mean, you can say the cinema. Cinema is also a whole issue about distribution. It's a whole issue about production. It's definitely an issue about writing and so on. I think the language of cinema is with us forever, and that's much more interesting to me personally than the language of television. There's some reasons you can go into, you can discuss that. You know, you can discuss small screen, big screen, you know, high resolution, not such high resolution, all those things. So I think that this work will be profoundly based on cinema, very profoundly. I mean, we'll go back to Bazin, we'll go into the French cineasts. It depends who you think invented cinema also, I mean, I suppose, or where you think that myth of cinema culturally lives. But for me, that, you know, lives in certainly as much in the French cinema or the European cinema as it lives in the American cinema. But we won't go back to a single celluloid strand that makes it so as you go to digital cinema, you're already in pieces.
But maybe taking from that, is it more about the idea of interactive story and not worrying if it's cinema or TV or digital media? But it seems like the struggle, you know, so many people have talked about interactive story and what does that mean and how does this new media help us think about interactive story? So isn't the hard problem the story, or isn't that really
I'm not interested in doing the story without the cinema piece. That has no interest, you know, if you look at hypertext stories, I find them totally uninteresting. I think we went beyond the power. I think cinema introduced us to a power of something that then you go back and
So like the piece, the kids' room, where the story was, you heard over the speakers, and so the kids were listening to the story, but using these objects to evoke the story.
And the characters were, I mean, yeah, the kids' room is slightly you know, the kids' room is not a database piece. It's not a piece where you have the granularity of shots or the granularity of sequences and you're putting them together in different ways, which I suppose most of my work has been about. The kids' room really is a traditional, it always plays out the same way with the exception of if you're in the wrong place. It tells you, you know, go over there.
Yeah. But is it cinema? I mean, do you see the...
No, I think that's, you know, that's story in an architecture. I mean, it's story sort of in the largest sense of the word, and it uses cinematic elements. The animations come out of cinema.
Right.
The animations actually also come out of book form, so
yeah.
Stills. I mean, it's interesting. I think for me, it's more the issue of if you have a database of shots that can be rearranged and have to be edited to use what has traditionally been cinematic language. Those are the stories that I'm most interested in.
Any other questions?
I've got a lot.
That's streaming.
It's streaming.
That's what, streaming?
Without the microphone, you hear nothing on the stream.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question was basically, you've talked about the language of cinema. I was wondering if you think it's possible at all that, like with other, like a paradigm shift almost, will have to occur in order for, like interactive storytelling, I guess, to become its own, or if it is just an extension of, cinema, and even like just a book is a nonlinear, in some respects. Story.
There are lots of people working on different aspects of this. So I don't think it's going to have one. We're going to have more different things, not fewer different things. So it doesn't have to resolve in, sort of immersive environments as environments for your imagination and for the structuring of story. Is what what is her name? You know, the woman who did a piece at Banff where you put on the not Brenda, but there's another one where you really are in the idea of this character's brain with the images of memory. And you can follow memory, and there's a lot of audio things that follow. But still, a lot of that does take from the language of cinema. It's also interactive story, and there are many, many people working on interactive story, as you said, you know, and I think different of us are more interested in different aspects of that.
I'd like to jump to your future interest. You were mentioning that you'd like to expand the idea of distributed story onto palm devices. Have you done any experiments or started mapping out how you imagine that working?
Yeah, we're working on that, actively working on it, both on the technology and also in the work I'm doing with the BBC right now. We're actually looking at this next story that's been commissioned already. There's a writer working on it to have, it will have regular broadcast elements, and then it will have a lot of elements in between.
And which devices would you be using? What are you experimenting with?
In that particular case, well, in the lab right now, we're working on something called StrongArm, which is a Intel device.
Is that a hardware you're talking about?
It's actually a hardware piece, but I'm more interested in cell phone size, you know, and how we deliver on cell phone.
So then you're actually back to the idea of kind of a hyperlinked text, because on a cell phone screen you can't have cinema.
Well, you can do two things. We can do two things on that. One is that you can transcode to just audio, and the other thing is you can bookmark aspects of the story that you want to go back and see, let's say, on your TV set or on your computer screen or whatever. So you actually can have a time warp, and that has a lot to do with how those elements are told, whether that becomes interesting or not. There's a fabulous piece that just opened, I forgot where it is, but there's somebody who does a video tour, and they have a Palm Pilot and a movie camera, and it's in a museum or someplace, and you see a zoom in the movie camera. You're looking at the playback, and you see a zoom, and you all of a sudden hear a conversation that's coming from way down in the bottom of the museum, and I don't know, it sounds actually fantastic, but you're mobile in space, and the story is coming to you based on these characters who are distributed in your space.
Are you familiar with Majestic?
Part of what? Yeah. Have you seen one of these?
No.
Yeah, it really is.
Are you familiar with Majestic?
No.
It's this new game that came out that's a kind of a mystery, and you're looking for a murderer. When you subscribe to it, you get faxes, you get palm kind of little, I mean, it gets kind of creepy actually. And they have problems releasing it because of kind of intellectual property, and, you know.
We did, Lee Morgenroth in '85, I think, we did a piece that ran on the web. It was the first movie, one of the first movies that had video on the web, and it started out, and you're all being sent email. We spun off groups of 6 people were in the audience, were participatory audience, and everybody thought they were actually talking to real characters, and in fact they were just getting pieces of email. But then people did the most extraordinary things, like one of the people who should have known better, I heard later, she got so frustrated by getting all this email that she created a folder and had all the email from the story went into the folder, and she read it 2 months later or something. She said, I didn't understand at all what was going on. So, I mean, there are lots of things, but that, yeah, that, I mean, it's sort of neat to create a sort of a real, a semi-real environment where you're interpreting, where you're getting the story elements through normal channels of communication.
Any other questions? We've gone a little late here.
Sorry.
No, that's good. Thank you. And Gloriana is going to be here on campus for the next couple of days, primarily meeting with grad students. But if anybody else wants a chance to talk with her, I'm sure we could find a time. So again, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Just some new ideas for thought.